Late 1960s, Memphis. The night is heavy after rain. The studio finally quiet. Elvis Presley steps out, his body aching from hours of recording, craving only silence and the steady comfort of his Cadillac waiting in the lot. But just as his hand brushes the chrome, a sound slips through the stillness. Thin, broken, almost too faint to notice. At first he ignores it. Just a stray, he thinks. The city is full of them. Yet the sound comes again, weaker, like a plea that might vanish if he turns away. Elvis crouches, and under the glow of the street lamp he sees it. A kitten no bigger than his palm, ribs showing, eyes half shut, clinging to life by a thread. For a heartbeat, the king of rock and roll is not a superstar, not the man the world shouts for. He is just a boy from Tupelo again, staring at hunger and helplessness he knows all too well. In that moment, one quiet decision will ripple far beyond the Memphis night, revealing not Elvis the icon, but Elvis the man, with a heart stubborn enough to stop everything for the smallest cry in the dark. Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. The night air of Memphis in 1969 carried a damp heaviness after a short rain, the kind that left the asphalt glistening like dark glass beneath the glow of the street lamps. The studio sessions at American Sound had gone long. The musicians had packed up their instruments, and most of the crew had already driven off. The block was quiet, broken only by the distant hum of traffic on McLemore Avenue. Elvis stepped out into the alley behind the studio, shoulders slightly slouched, the collar of his silk shirt turned up against the cool air. His bodyguards instinctively formed a semicircle around him, scanning the shadows like always. But tonight, he lifted a hand, gentle yet firm, and signaled them to hold back. "Give me a minute," he murmured, his voice low but decisive. He wanted to breathe on his own for once, away from the constant orbit of handlers, schedules, and expectations. The Cadillac parked at the edge of the lot gleamed under the streetlight. Its black surface was still speckled with droplets, each one catching reflections of neon flickers from a diner sign across the road. Elvis walked slowly toward it, his boots crunching against loose gravel. The smell of wet pavement mixed with faint traces of gasoline and the musky scent of magnolia trees nearby. For a moment, he simply stood there, his reflection stretching along the polished side of the car. Then he heard it. At first, he thought it was the wind pushing through a broken gutter, a thin, reedy sound that barely rose above the hum of the night. He paused, tilting his head, listening harder. There it was again, a fragile mew, so faint it could easily be mistaken for something else. Elvis frowned, scanning the shadows near the Cadillac. He crouched slightly, peering toward the rear wheel. The sound came again, this time unmistakable. He stepped closer, lowering himself until the pavement dampened the knees of his trousers. And there, tucked against the rubber of the back tire, was a tiny shape, no bigger than his hand. A kitten. Its fur clung in damp clumps to a body so thin the outline of ribs pressed starkly against its sides. The creature tried to move, wobbling on unsteady legs, and collapsed again, its small cry breaking off into silence. Behind him, one of the bodyguards cleared his throat. "Sir, want me to take care of that? I'll shoo it off." Elvis turned sharply, his eyes flashing in the dim light. "Don't touch it!" His tone carried no anger, but it was edged with a steel finality that froze the man in place. The star leaned closer, studying the fragile form huddled beside the wheel. A faint tremor passed through him, though not from the chill of the night. He felt the incongruity of it, the Cadillac, a symbol of wealth and triumph, gleaming like a jewel in the dark. And beside it, life in its most vulnerable state, shivering, abandoned, nearly invisible. The kitten blinked up at him, its eyes watery and clouded, but there was a flicker of something. Trust, or maybe just surrender. Elvis inhaled deeply, the smell of damp tar filling his lungs, and for a long moment, the alley behind the studio ceased to exist. There was no bodyguard, no schedule, no shadow of expectation pressing on him. Just the quiet beat of his own heart and the fragile pulse of the creature in the shadows. He knelt fully now, the gravel biting through the fabric of his pants. He reached a careful hand toward the kitten, fingers extended with the same delicacy he reserved for handling fine guitars. The little body flinched, but did not flee. Slowly, Elvis slid his palm beneath its belly, lifting it gently into the cool night air. It weighed almost nothing. Its fur was coarse, stiffened with dirt, and when he held it close, he could feel the faint flutter of its ribs against his palm, as though the creature's life was measured in seconds. A faint, broken purr escaped its throat, surprising him with its softness. His chest tightened. He stared at the kitten, and something unexplainable crossed his face. Astonishment mingled with a deep, almost aching sympathy. The world expected Elvis Presley to be unshakable, larger than life, a man who filled stadiums and silenced crowds with a single note. But here, under the dim glow of a street lamp, he was simply another soul staring at frailty and recognizing it. Behind him, another guard muttered, unsure, "Boss, it's just a stray. Could be sick. Ain't worth the trouble." Elvis didn't look away from the kitten. His voice, when it came, was quiet, but carried the unyielding tone of command. Everything's worth something if it's still breathing. He adjusted the small body in his hands, tucking it close to his chest to shield it from the chill. The kitten pressed its nose weakly against the silk of his shirt, leaving a faint smudge of dirt. Elvis didn't notice. He was still watching, eyes fixed as though trying to memorize every detail, the twitch of its whiskers, the sharp angle of its bones, the fragile rise and fall of its chest. For the first time in hours, the exhaustion of the studio faded. The music, the arguments over arrangements, the endless second-guessing of his comeback, it all slipped into the background. What remained was silence, broken only by the tiny rasp of the kitten's breath and the steady thrum of his own heartbeat. The Cadillac shimmered behind him, its chrome edges catching the dim glow of the lamps. Elvis glanced at the car, then back at the fragile creature in his arms. The juxtaposition struck him deeply. The black sheen of luxury that the world admired, and the fragile, almost weightless reminder of how easily life could vanish. His eyes softened, but they did not waver. He stood slowly, cradling the kitten as though it were more precious than anything he had carried that day. The guards shifted uneasily, confused by the sudden turn of events, but none dared speak again. Elvis Presley, the man who had filled charts and theaters, stood in a quiet Memphis lot, holding a trembling stray. And in that moment, beneath the soft hiss of the night, nothing else seemed to matter. Elvis leaned back against the cool metal of the Cadillac, the kitten still trembling lightly in his arms. Its tiny head rested against his chest, and every shallow breath reminded him just how close the little life in his hands was to vanishing. He sat down slowly on the edge of the hood, not caring that the polished paint might pick up scratches from his belt buckle. The night air pressed in, carrying the faint echo of passing traffic and the far-off sound of a train horn cutting through the quiet. The kitten hardly moved, only shifting once to curl tighter into the warmth of his palm. Its surrender stirred something in him that was older than fame, older than music, older than everything his name had come to mean. Memories, uninvited and raw, began to creep back. Tupelo. The red clay dust that clung to his shoes, the narrow streets where he ran barefoot with boys who all knew what hunger felt like. A crooked little house where the walls were thin and the nights often colder than the blankets could manage. He remembered lying in bed, listening to the sound of his mother's voice, humming softly to keep fear away. Hunger wasn't just in their stomachs then. It hung in the air, pressed into the silence of the rooms. And with that memory came another, a mutt of a dog that used to linger behind the local grocery store. Elvis was no more than 7, clutching a crust of bread he had saved from supper. The dog's ribs showed like the strings of his guitar would years later, each one visible, a map of need and survival. He had walked up to it carefully, hands shaking a little, and offered the bread. The dog devoured it so quickly he was afraid it might choke. That night, his mother had knelt by his bed and kissed his forehead. "Son," she told him gently, "your heart's bigger than your pocket. That's worth more than money will ever be." The words echoed now, carried across decades as he looked at the small bundle of fur in his arms. He could almost see his mother's face in the darkness, the warm steadiness of her eyes. It struck him that in some way, every kindness he gave, even now, with the world watching his every move, was still shaped by her voice in that small Tupelo room. He rubbed his thumb lightly along the kitten's back, feeling each ridge of bone beneath the fragile skin. A bitterness rose in him, not toward the animal, but toward the memory of helplessness. As a boy, he'd wanted to rescue every stray, every creature abandoned or forgotten. But he'd had nothing to give. No food, no warm blanket, not even the certainty of his own next meal. He had carried that frustration like a hidden scar, a reminder of how powerless he once was. Now things were different. He thought of the suits hanging in his closet, the Cadillac gleaming under the streetlight, the checks his manager had stacked for him earlier that week. Money and attention, the things people believed defined success. He had them in abundance. Yet here, with this fragile life clinging weakly to his warmth, all those riches seemed hollow unless he used them to change the ending of a story he had once known too well. The kitten stirred faintly, letting out a thin rasp of a mewl, its voice like sand scraping across glass. Elvis tightened his arms just slightly, whispering without thinking, "You're safe now, little fella." His drawl softened the words into a melody, more lullaby than statement. For a long moment, he stared into the middle distance, letting his mind drift deeper. He remembered the long walks to school, shoes worn down to the soles, and how often he'd stopped to watch animals rummaging through trash. Once he had seen a litter of kittens behind a shed, so hungry they gnawed on scraps of paper. He had wanted to scoop them up, carry them home, but he'd known better. His family barely had enough to feed themselves. The helplessness had burned. And now, as he looked at the creature in his arms, he realized something unexpected. The ache was still there, but this time he could do something about it. The years had carried him far from Tupelo's dirt roads, but they had not erased the boy who had once shared his bread with a stray dog. That boy was still inside him, whispering that every life mattered, no matter how small. A breeze moved through the alley, stirring the smell of wet asphalt and gasoline. The neon sign across the street buzzed faintly, sputtering on one side. He thought about how easy it would be, too easy, to hand the kitten over to someone else, to let one of his men drop it at the edge of town or into a shelter. That's what the world expected. For Elvis Presley to keep moving, to remain untouchable, never slowed down by something so ordinary. But he knew in his bones that if he did that, if he turned his back now, he'd be betraying not just this small creature, but the boy he once was. He shifted his gaze downward again, studying the way the kitten's eyelids fluttered, half asleep, half fighting to stay alive. A knot tightened in his chest. The years of luxury, the stages lit like daylight, the rooms filled with applause. None of it erased the feeling that true worth was measured in the moments no one else saw. And here he was, in a quiet Memphis lot, with a decision that seemed insignificant to anyone else, but felt like a reckoning. He thought again of his mother's words, "Your heart's bigger than your pocket." For the first time that night, a faint smile crossed his face. It wasn't the polished smile for cameras, the grin that melted crowds. It was small, private, unguarded, the smile of a boy from Tupelo who finally had the chance to do what he'd always wanted, to make sure the smallest, weakest life did not have to face the world alone. The kitten let out another faint sound, more purr than cry this time. Elvis lowered his cheek to rest briefly against its damp fur. "I got you now," he whispered, and though no one else in that alley could sense it, in that moment he felt a strange kind of peace, like something long unsettled inside him had finally been answered. The night had grown deeper, the city wrapped in shadows broken by pockets of neon glow. Elvis still sat on the Cadillac's hood, the kitten curled against his chest, when the sound of polished shoes scraped against the gravel behind him. One of the guards stepped closer, his voice uncertain. "Mr. Presley," he began carefully, "your driver's waiting. We ought to get moving. You've got an early call tomorrow. Schedule's tight." The words floated in the air, reminders of the machinery that always surrounded him. The endless shows, interviews, rehearsals. The wheels of fame that never stopped turning. Normally, Elvis would have nodded, slid into the car, and allowed the night to swallow up whatever momentary distraction lingered in his path. But tonight was different. He looked down at the fragile animal in his arms. Its tiny body had gone still again, save for the faint rise and fall of breath. He felt the small heartbeat tapping against his palm, fragile yet stubborn. His gaze hardened, though not with anger, with resolve. "No," he said softly at first, then louder, more certain. "We ain't going home. We're finding this little one something to eat." The guard blinked, caught off guard by the sudden firmness in Elvis's tone. Another man, standing near the rear door of the Cadillac, frowned. "Sir, it's late. Most places are shut. We can take care of that tomorrow." Elvis shook his head. "Tomorrow might be too late. We go now." He stood, moving toward the car. One of the men hurried forward to open the back door, but Elvis shifted the kitten gently in his arms and headed for the driver's side instead. He wasn't about to sit in the back like a passenger tonight. This was personal. Sliding into the leather seat, he ignored the dirt smudges the kitten left on his shirt and trousers. The idea of claw marks or stains on the Cadillac, normally unthinkable, didn't cross his mind. He adjusted the rearview mirror, then glanced down at the small creature on his lap. The kitten blinked up at him with weary eyes, almost too tired to react. From outside, his assistant leaned down toward the window, voice carrying an edge of caution. "Sir, if that thing's sick, you don't know what it could be carrying. It's not safe." Elvis exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening. "You know what's not safe," he answered quietly. "Leaving it out here to die." There was no room for argument in his tone. The assistant straightened, swallowing hard, and stepped back. The guards exchanged uneasy glances, unused to seeing the king so immovable on something so small. The engine rumbled to life, filling the alley with its deep growl. Elvis rested one hand on the wheel, the other lightly against the kitten's back, steadying it against the vibration. The Cadillac's polished chrome reflected the dim light, a sharp contrast to the fragile life it now carried inside. The kitten shifted faintly, letting out a soft, broken purr that reached his ears like a secret meant only for him. Elvis's lips curved into the faintest smile, not one for the stage or the flashbulbs, but one born of quiet recognition that sometimes the smallest sound could carry the greatest weight. The headlights swept across the brick walls of the alley as he pulled forward. Behind him, his security detail climbed reluctantly into their own car, trailing close. Their radios crackled with routine updates, but none of them seemed sure what to say about their employer's unexpected detour. Elvis pressed gently on the accelerator, guiding the car out onto the slick streets of Memphis. The city stretched ahead, quiet but restless, neon lights humming above empty sidewalks. He caught his own reflection briefly in the side window, sunglasses still on despite the hour, shirt rumpled, an unlikely chauffeur to a half-starved stray. The absurdity of the image wasn't lost on him. Here was Elvis Presley, the man headlines called untouchable, the voice of a generation, with the world's eyes constantly on him. Yet the most important passenger he'd ever carried weighed no more than a handful of air. The kitten shifted again, curling tighter into the crook of his arm. And for the first time that night, Elvis felt a calmness settle over him. It was as if all the noise, the expectations, the obligations, the endless demands had been muted, leaving only this simple truth. He had the power to save a life, and he wasn't about to squander it. The red glow of a traffic light caught him as he reached the next intersection. He eased the Cadillac to a stop, the engine humming beneath his hand. The kitten stirred, letting out a faint whimper, and Elvis instinctively leaned down, murmuring softly, "Easy now, little one. I'm right here." The light turned green, but he lingered a moment longer, unwilling to break the fragile peace. Cars behind him honked, impatient, but he didn't care. He waited until the kitten stilled again, until its tiny body relaxed against him, before easing forward once more. As the Cadillac glided through the sleeping city, Elvis realized something unexpected. This wasn't just about rescuing a stray. It was about reclaiming something inside himself that had been buried beneath the weight of his fame. The boy from Tupelo, the one who had once given his bread to a hungry dog, was still here, older, wealthier, but unchanged where it mattered most. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel, guiding the car toward the glow of the few late-night stores still open. The guards might mutter, his assistant might fret, the world might never even know what he was doing, but none of that mattered. What mattered was the fragile life pressed against his chest, purring faintly despite the odds. And with that, his decision was sealed. Nothing, no schedule, no stage, no expectation, would take precedence over it. Not tonight. The streets of Memphis stretched ahead like ribbons of wet glass, slick from the earlier rain. The Cadillac's headlights carved two pale tunnels through the darkness, their beams reflecting against storefront windows and neon signs that buzzed faintly, some half-lit, some flickering as though clinging to life. The hour had emptied most of the city, sidewalks barren, only the occasional late-night wanderer drifting under the street lamps. Elvis drove with one hand steady on the wheel, the other resting protectively against the kitten curled on his lap. The little creature shifted every so often, giving off a faint mewl or a fragile purr, its ribs moving in shallow rhythm against his palm. Each sound tugged at him, as though reminding him that the night's errand was not about indulgence, but survival. Behind him, the dark shape of another car followed close, his security detail, headlights low. They kept their distance, unsure whether to intervene, unwilling to question his judgment openly. From time to time, Elvis glanced into the mirror, catching the faint red glow of their dashboard lights, but his focus always returned to the road. Memphis, after midnight, held its own rhythm. The air carried a blend of gasoline fumes and frying grease drifting from 24-hour diners. Somewhere, music leaked from a bar left open too long, a wailing guitar, a harmonica cutting through the stillness before fading back into silence. It was a city alive in fragments, each corner offering a flicker of story, though most of the world slept through it. Elvis slowed at a red light on Union Avenue, the Cadillac's engine rumbling low. He leaned slightly down, whispering to the kitten, whose eyes opened just enough to glance at him before closing again. "Hang on, buddy. We'll get you something soon." His voice was softer than a prayer, almost lost under the hum of the motor. The light changed, but instead of accelerating immediately, he lingered, unwilling to jolt the fragile passenger. The cars behind him honked again, but he ignored them, easing forward only when the kitten had resettled into stillness. In the quiet hum of the drive, his thoughts drifted. He remembered the first Cadillac he had ever owned, how it had felt like stepping into a dream stitched together by hard labor and impossible hope. Back then, the car had been a symbol of escape, from poverty, from invisibility, from the limits of Tupelo. Tonight, though, the Cadillac seemed transformed. No longer a chariot of success, but a shelter, carrying the smallest of lives through a city that might not have noticed it otherwise. He pulled into a side street lined with dim shops, most dark behind their metal shutters. A lone convenience store still glowed at the corner, its fluorescent lights buzzing faintly against the night. The parking lot was empty, save for a rusted pickup truck and a soda machine humming against the wall. Elvis parked, shutting off the engine. The silence that followed was thick, broken only by the faint squeak of the Cadillac's cooling frame. The kitten stirred, opening its mouth in a weak cry. Elvis stroked its back once, before lifting it gently into the crook of his arm. "We're getting you fed, little one," he murmured, then pushed the door open. The night air was cool, tinged with the sharp scent of asphalt. His boots echoed against the pavement as he crossed the lot, cradling the kitten close. Inside, the store was lit too bright, almost harsh after the shadows of the street. A bell above the door jingled as he stepped in, drawing the attention of the lone clerk behind the counter. At first, the young man didn't recognize him. He saw only a tall figure in a dark jacket and sunglasses, strange attire for the hour, carrying something small against his chest. It wasn't until Elvis stepped closer, the light catching his profile, that realization struck. The clerk's eyes widened, and his mouth opened slightly as though to speak, but no words came. Elvis gave him a brief nod, then spoke plainly, his voice low but steady. "I need some milk, and something soft enough this little one can eat." He shifted his arm slightly, revealing the frail kitten nestled against him. The clerk blinked, caught between awe and confusion. Elvis Presley, the man whose records filled jukeboxes and radios across the country, was standing in his store at 1 a.m, asking not for cigarettes or whiskey, but for milk for a stray cat. The young man scrambled, fumbling with the cooler door, retrieving a small carton. He glanced around, as though unsure what else to offer, then added a pack of soft bread rolls, setting them nervously on the counter. Elvis placed a few bills down, more than enough to cover the cost. He didn't wait for change, only adjusted the kitten's position in his arms. The animal stirred at the sound of the register's bell, eyes half opening before drifting shut again. "Thank you," Elvis said simply. His voice carried no grandeur, only sincerity. As he turned to leave, the clerk stood frozen, watching the scene with disbelief. He would later tell the story dozens of times, how the king of rock and roll had walked into his store on a rainy Memphis night, not with an entourage or flashing lights, but with a starving kitten tucked against his chest. The bell jingled again as Elvis pushed the door open. Outside, the neon sign above the store buzzed faintly, casting a soft glow over the Cadillac parked beneath it. His guards were still in their car, watching but not interfering. He walked back slowly, the carton of milk tucked under his arm, the kitten pressed against his chest, as though it were the only thing anchoring him to the moment. The city around him remained indifferent, neon lights humming, pavement slick, air filled with the faint tang of fried food and gasoline. But for Elvis, everything felt sharpened, more vivid. Each breath of the kitten, each fragile stir, seemed to carry more weight than the echoes of applause he'd heard earlier that week. Sliding back into the driver's seat, he set the milk beside him and glanced down at his fragile companion. "We're on our way now," he whispered, the words carrying a promise as steady as any vow he had ever made. And with that, the Cadillac rolled once more into the night, its headlights sweeping through the sleeping city, carrying a king and his most unlikely passenger deeper into their shared journey. The bell over the door jingled as Elvis stepped back into the cool night air. The carton of milk was tucked beneath one arm, the kitten held close against his chest with the other. For a second, he thought the lot was still as empty as when he had entered, but movement near the Cadillac caught his eye. A handful of people had gathered, drawn by the sight of the long black car idling under the neon glow. A couple walking home from the diner down the street, two teenagers on bicycles who had stopped when they spotted the distinctive chrome, and an older man in a work jacket leaning against the wall of the store, curious. They whispered among themselves, nudging each other, until Elvis emerged fully into the light. The murmurs swelled into an audible ripple. Even at this late hour, recognition was instant. His face was too familiar, his presence too singular. The king of rock and roll, standing under the flicker of a tired neon bulb with no stage, no microphone, no spotlight. Just him. He walked steadily toward the Cadillac, boots sounding against the wet pavement. The crowd edged closer, hesitant but unable to resist. For a moment, it seemed like any other encounter fans might dream of, a chance to glimpse their idol up close. But then they noticed what he carried. At first, it wasn't clear. A bundle against his chest, small enough to be mistaken for a folded jacket or a bag of groceries. But when he shifted his arm, the kitten's tiny head lifted, its ears twitching at the hum of the soda machine by the door. The sight stopped everyone cold. Silence spread across the small group. Their eyes moved from the weary creature in his hands to the man holding it, and something shifted in the air. It wasn't the roar of applause or the shrieks that usually followed him. It was something quieter, more reverent. The two boys on bicycles stared wide-eyed, their handlebars forgotten beneath their palms. One of them whispered, barely audible, "Is that his pet?" His friend elbowed him but never looked away. An older woman who had paused on her way past with a shopping bag over her arm clutched the strap tighter, her mouth softening into an almost maternal smile. She had expected, perhaps, a flash of celebrity arrogance, the distance of a man too big for ordinary life. Instead, she saw tenderness, simple, unguarded, without any pretense. Elvis met their stares calmly, his eyes tired but steady. He could feel the questions forming in their silence, the unspoken curiosity. Slowly, deliberately, he tilted his arms just enough to show the kitten fully, its frail body curled against him, still clinging to the warmth it had found. A boy in the crowd finally broke the hush. "Mr. Presley, is that your new mascot?" His voice cracked slightly, caught between awe and the innocent wonder of a child. For a beat, Elvis didn't answer. He looked down at the kitten, whose small paw had shifted to press faintly against his shirt. A smile touched his mouth, not the dazzling grin polished for cameras, but something smaller, closer to private amusement. "Could be," he said softly. "Maybe it is." The crowd exhaled as though they had all been holding their breath. Some chuckled nervously, others smiled openly. A couple even clapped, not with the wild energy of a concert, but with the quiet admiration reserved for something honest, something that broke through the surface of fame and revealed the man beneath it. Elvis didn't linger in their attention. He shifted the milk under his arm and moved toward the Cadillac, his steps unhurried. The guards by the other car stood watchful, surprised at the scene, but letting it unfold. As he opened the driver's door, one of the teenagers called out, "Take care of him, Mr. Presley." He glanced over his shoulder and gave a small nod. Nothing grand, but enough. The boy grinned, gripping his handlebars so tight his knuckles went white. He would remember that moment for the rest of his life. The kitten mewed faintly as Elvis settled back behind the wheel, the carton set carefully on the seat beside him. He stroked the small back with his thumb, feeling the tremor beneath fur that was finally warming. Around him, the onlookers lingered, still processing what they had seen. Not the king in rhinestones, commanding a stage, but a man in the middle of a quiet Memphis night, choosing to cradle a life most would have walked past. As the Cadillac's engine rumbled alive, no one moved to block his way. They only stood back, watching the car glide slowly out of the lot. A few lifted their hands in tentative waves. Someone whispered, almost reverently, "That's what makes him different." The neon sign flickered behind him, the store shrinking in the rearview mirror. Ahead lay the silent streets, carrying him toward whatever came next. But for those few witnesses left in the glow of the buzzing light, the memory would stay. How a man the world called untouchable had stopped for a stray, and in doing so, seemed closer than ever. The hotel room was hushed, save for the faint whir of the air conditioner that rattled occasionally like a restless breath. Midnight had long passed, yet Elvis sat awake, jacket draped across the back of a chair, silk shirt undone at the collar. His eyes were fixed not on the gilded lamps or the heavy curtains drawn against the city, but on the small life wobbling unsteadily across the carpet. The kitten, newly introduced to warmth and safety, had perked up when he poured a saucer of milk onto the low table and set it down within reach. Its paws slipped clumsily against the patterned carpet as it bent forward, lapping greedily, milk spilling onto its whiskers, its chin, and, soon enough, the rug itself. Elvis laughed quietly, a soft sound that seemed to lighten the heavy air. He reached for a towel, crouched down, and wiped the mess with his own hands. A guard standing near the door shifted as if to intervene, but Elvis waved him back without looking up. "I've got this," he said simply, a tone that allowed no argument. He stayed crouched there, watching the kitten drink as though it were the most important performance of the night. The sight of its tiny body trembling with determination touched something deep within him. For once, he wasn't the center of attention, wasn't the man expected to hold the weight of the room. He was merely a caretaker, and that felt unexpectedly right. When the kitten finally pulled away, belly rounded slightly from its first real meal in days, it gave a clumsy attempt at grooming, licking milk off its paw before collapsing onto the carpet in exhaustion. Elvis lowered himself beside it, stretching out on the floor, in a way that ignored the stiffness creeping into his limbs. One of the men near the door cleared his throat. "Sir, maybe you should get some rest. Big day tomorrow." Elvis didn't answer at first. He lay on his side, head propped on one hand, eyes fixed on the fragile creature now dozing just inches away. At last he murmured, almost to himself, "Funny thing. Feels like I saved more than just him tonight." His gaze softened, distant. "Feels like maybe I pulled something back from losing myself." The guard said nothing more. He had seen Elvis in countless moods, triumphant, exhausted, furious, playful. But this one was different. This was quiet, steady, like the silence that comes after a storm. After a long pause, Elvis rose, careful not to disturb the sleeping kitten. He poured a fresh bit of milk into the saucer and set it aside, ready for when it woke again. Then he stepped to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to glimpse the city below. Memphis glittered faintly, its neon signs buzzing, streets winding like veins through the night. Yet none of it seemed to press on him the way it usually did. He turned back, eyes returning inevitably to the small form curled on the rug. Something inside him loosened. All the pressure, the rehearsals, the critics, the endless demands, faded in the presence of that simple act of care. He understood then that the strength people admired in him didn't come from fame or power. It came from moments like this, when he chose compassion over convenience. A thought settled in his mind, firm as stone. Tomorrow, before anything else, he would take the kitten to a doctor. Schedules could wait. Contracts, interviews, rehearsals, they could all pause. Life could not. He sank into a chair, exhaustion finally creeping into his body. But even as his eyes closed for a moment, his ears remained tuned to the faint sound of breathing on the carpet. He realized, with a small smile, that the sound was as grounding as any hymn he had ever heard. A little later, one of his close aides stepped into the room, carrying a folder of notes for the upcoming Vegas run. "We need your signature on the flight confirmation," the aide began, laying the folder down. He paused when he noticed the scene. Elvis half asleep in the chair, the kitten sprawled like a tiny sentinel on the rug, the saucer beside it. The aide hesitated. "Sir, are you sure this is worth—" Elvis opened one eye, gaze steady. "Worth it? More than you know." His voice was quiet, but final. The aide nodded silently, retreating toward the door. The papers remained unsigned. As the night deepened, Elvis drifted in and out of light sleep, waking each time the kitten stirred. Once, he reached down, lifting it gently into his lap, cradling it with the ease of someone who had done the same for countless guitars, each note coaxed with tenderness. The kitten purred faintly, a vibration so small yet steady, and Elvis leaned back, letting the sound settle into him like a balm. The room around them was grand. Thick carpeting, polished wood furniture, a chandelier overhead, but in that moment it felt stripped of all its ostentation. What mattered was a man and a creature bound together by need and care. Before dawn broke, Elvis whispered, almost as though speaking to his mother across the years, "I'll see this one through. I promise." The words hung in the air, solemn as any vow he had ever made. And in the stillness that followed, the king of rock and roll, surrounded by the quiet hum of machines and the fragile breath of a stray, felt more human and more whole than he had in a long time. Dawn broke slowly over Memphis, the first pale light seeping between heavy curtains and brushing across the carpet. The air was cool and faintly metallic, carrying that strange stillness of early morning before the city fully woke. Elvis sat in a hotel armchair, a robe drawn loosely over his shoulders, watching the kitten curled in a nest of folded towels on the low table. He hadn't slept properly. His eyes were shadowed, yet alert, as if every stir of the small body anchored him to the present. The kitten seemed stronger now, lifting its head with a flicker of curiosity, before collapsing again, exhausted. Elvis leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, studying it intently. He felt relief, but also urgency. Every breath the creature took reminded him it was still fragile, still on the edge. The door opened softly behind him. One of his assistants stepped in, carrying a clipboard, face tight with the weight of obligations. "Sir," he began carefully, "we need to leave for the airport in less than 2 hours. Vegas is waiting. The Hilton's sold out. Press is lined up, and—" Elvis raised a hand, silencing him without looking away from the kitten. His voice was calm, almost detached, but immovable. "I'm not getting on any plane until I take him to a doctor." The words hung heavy. The assistant blinked, startled. "Sir, with respect, that's impossible. Thousands of tickets. Reporters already in town. If we delay, it'll be chaos." Elvis turned at last, meeting the man's eyes. His gaze was steady, without anger but full of finality. "Chaos is letting a life slip away when you could have done something about it." The assistant faltered, glancing at the kitten, then back at Elvis. He tried again, softer this time. "You've built too much to risk it now." Elvis shook his head, voice low but sharp. "What good's buildin' if you forget why you're standin' in the first place?" The room went quiet. The aide lowered his clipboard, realizing no argument would move him. A knock rattled the door. Before anyone could respond, it opened just enough for another aide to poke his head in, his expression tense. "Press is in the hall. Somebody tipped them off. They've heard about the cat." Elvis straightened in his chair, robe falling slightly open at the chest. For a moment he considered ignoring it, but then the decision crystallized. He stood, walked to the table, and lifted the kitten into his arms with careful steadiness. Then let 'em see. The hallway outside was already crowded. Photographers jostled for space, flashes popping as soon as the door opened. Voices rose in a sudden storm of questions, most disjointed, overlapping, none answered. Elvis stepped forward, the kitten nestled in his robe, its tiny face peeking out. The hallway fell abruptly, quieter. The sight of him in the stark morning light, hair tousled, face bare of stage polish, holding a frail animal against his chest. It froze the crowd in place. No speeches, no explanations. He simply walked past them, the kitten his only shield. Cameras clicked, reporters scribbled, but no one dared press too close. Something about the gravity of his expression warned them that this wasn't theater. This was real. In the lobby, hotel staff scrambled to maintain order, but guests peered from behind columns, whispering as he passed. Some gasped, others smiled faintly, moved by the image. He ignored it all, heading straight for the waiting car. Sliding into the back seat, he cradled the kitten carefully on his lap. His guards piled in behind, tension buzzing in the cramped space. One muttered under his breath, "This is gonna be everywhere by noon." Elvis didn't respond. He stroked the kitten's back lightly, as though the world outside had ceased to exist. The car pulled away from the curb, moving through the awakening city. Sunlight crept over rooftops, glinting against windows, catching in puddles left from last night's rain. Traffic was beginning to thicken, horns blaring faintly in the distance, but inside the car, silence held. Elvis looked down at the small creature, now dozing again. His mind wandered briefly to the stage lights of Las Vegas, the roar of the crowd, the pressure of expectation. All of it waited for him, but none of it outweighed the immediate, fragile breath in his hands. The assistant across from him finally spoke, hesitant. "You're risking more than a concert, sir. This it could shake things." Elvis's gaze didn't lift from the kitten. His voice was steady, softer now but resolute. "Then let it shake. Some things need shaken." No one argued again. The city streets blurred past. The Cadillac carried him not toward the airport, not toward the life everyone demanded of him, but toward a small clinic tucked away in a quieter part of Memphis, a place where, for once, the only spotlight would shine on survival, not spectacle. And as the car rolled on, Elvis felt a curious calm settle over him. He had made his choice, and for the first time in a long while, it felt like the right one. Not for the crowd, not for the headlines, but for himself. The car rolled to a halt in front of a squat brick building tucked between a laundromat and a pawn shop. No neon lights, no polished facade, just a faded sign that read Veterinary Clinic, letters peeling from years of weather. It was the kind of place most passed by without notice. Yet this was where Elvis directed his driver to stop. The morning sun was climbing higher, warming the damp air, and the streets were beginning to buzz with life. Elvis stepped out, robe exchanged for a simple jacket, hair brushed back but not styled for cameras. The kitten rested quietly in his arms, its tiny body barely visible beneath the fold of the fabric he had wrapped around it. Inside, the waiting room smelled faintly of antiseptic and damp fur. Metal chairs lined the walls, already occupied by people clutching leashes, cardboard boxes, or worn towels. A hound with drooping ears rested its head on its owner's knee. A boy held a guinea pig close against his chest. An elderly woman whispered to a terrier trembling in her lap. Conversations dipped into silence when the door swung open and Elvis Presley walked in. Heads turned, eyes widened, murmurs rippled. Some blinked in disbelief, certain they were mistaken. But there he was, in the plain light of morning, not on stage, not in rhinestones, standing quietly with a fragile kitten pressed to his chest. His security detail lingered near the entrance, tense, waiting for him to ask for privacy. But Elvis made no move in that direction. Instead, he stepped toward the receptionist's desk and said in a low, clear voice, "We'll wait our turn." The woman behind the counter looked flustered, her hand trembling on the appointment sheet. "Mr. Presley, of course, we can take you right in," she stammered. Elvis shook his head gently. "These folks were here first. We'll wait." The room remained hushed, the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead filling the silence. People exchanged glances, unsure whether to speak, yet no one left. A boy with the guinea pig stared openly, his mouth half open, until his mother nudged him lightly. Elvis lowered himself into one of the metal chairs, careful not to jostle the kitten. Its eyes fluttered open briefly, catching the light, before it nestled deeper into his jacket. He smoothed a hand across its back, the motion calm, deliberate, almost meditative. Minutes passed. Slowly, the room's atmosphere shifted. Conversations resumed, though softer, punctuated by glances in his direction. A little girl tugged at her father's sleeve, whispering, "That's him." Her father nodded silently, eyes fixed on Elvis as though trying to reconcile the man before him with the legend plastered on billboards across America. One by one, names were called, and patients disappeared behind the swinging door to the examination rooms. Still, Elvis waited, hands steady, gaze fixed on the kitten. When at last his turn came, he rose, thanking the receptionist with a nod, and followed the veterinarian into the back. The room smelled sharper: alcohol, medicine, the faint musk of animals. A steel table stood in the center, papers clipped to the wall. The veterinarian, A middle-aged man with tired eyes and sleeves rolled up, looked from Elvis to the bundle in his arms. "Let's have a look," he said gently. Elvis laid the kitten down with a care that made the man pause. For a moment, the king of rock and roll seemed less like a patient's owner, and more like a father letting go of something precious. The doctor examined the animal with practiced movements, probing gently, listening to its heartbeat, checking its mouth and eyes. His expression was professional, but there was no disguising the hesitation in his pause. "It's weak," the man admitted quietly. "Very malnourished. Dehydrated. There's a chance it won't make it." The words landed heavy in the sterile room. Elvis didn't flinch, though his jaw tightened. He rested a hand lightly on the kitten's side, feeling the frail breath beneath his palm. "There's still a chance," he said firmly, as if closing the door to doubt. The veterinarian studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Yes, with care and attention. It will need feeding, warmth, medicine, and patience." Elvis straightened, his voice steady, his eyes unwavering. "Whatever it takes." The doctor gave instructions: what to feed, how often, how to keep it warm. Elvis listened closely, committing each word to memory, asking careful questions. Fame had no bearing here. He was simply a man learning how to keep another life alive. When the exam was done, Elvis lifted the kitten back into his arms. It stirred faintly, mewing with a rasp that sounded both fragile and defiant. He tucked it closer, murmuring softly, "We'll get through this, little one." As he stepped back into the waiting room, the others looked up again. This time the silence felt different. Not shock, but quiet respect. He didn't seek their eyes, didn't play to the room. He simply walked toward the door, cradling the kitten with the same steady care. Yet the moment imprinted itself on everyone there. The boy with the guinea pig whispered, "He waited, just like us." The elderly woman stroked her terrier and said under her breath, "That's what greatness looks like." By the time Elvis climbed back into his car, word had already begun to spread. Stories would ripple through Memphis by evening, how the king had sat in a small clinic, waiting patiently with the rest, refusing special treatment, holding a stray as though it were treasure. It would become more than a story about a cat. It would become a symbol, a reminder that compassion could be louder than applause, that humility could be more striking than spectacle. And though Elvis himself gave no thought to symbols as the car pulled away, the kitten breathing faintly against his chest, others already understood that they had witnessed something larger than a simple visit to a veterinarian. They had glimpsed the humanity that made his legend real. Las Vegas shimmered in the evening heat, its strip alive with restless neon and the hum of expectation. Inside the Hilton showroom, anticipation was palpable. The orchestra tuned their instruments, ushers guided guests to their seats, and the low murmur of a sold-out crowd filled the cavernous space. Everywhere there was glitter, perfume, and the electric charge that always preceded his entrance. Backstage, Elvis adjusted the cuffs of his suit, the iconic white fabric heavy with embroidery. His manager leaned in, voice clipped. "Don't mention the cat tonight. It's not the right note. We need spectacle, not sentimentality." Elvis met him with a quiet glance, steady and unflinching. "I'll say what I need to say." The manager hesitated, exasperation flickering, but one look at Elvis's expression silenced him. The man who had once been coaxed and managed into every detail of performance now stood untouchable, not by fame, but by conviction. The curtain lifted, the lights burst down on him, the crowd erupted, a roar that shook the walls. Elvis began as always, with music, voice rich, commanding, filling the space like a tide. Song after song rolled out, energy surging. The audience swept into his rhythm. Yet beneath the spectacle, a thought pressed at him, steady and insistent. Near the midpoint, when the applause hung heavy in the air, Elvis lifted a hand. The band stilled, the room falling into a hush. He stepped closer to the microphone, gaze sweeping across thousands of expectant faces. "Folks," he began, his drawl warm but solemn, "I want to tell you something that happened back home." The audience leaned in, the silence thick. He spoke plainly, without flourish. He told them about the night outside the studio, the cry he'd heard, the small life trembling by his car. He told them how easy it would have been to turn away, how the world was full of reasons to keep moving, to stay too busy, too important. But he hadn't. "Sometimes," he said, voice steady, "the biggest things you'll ever do start with the smallest ones. Even the tiniest life can remind you what matters most." The room was motionless. No coughs, no whispers, only the weight of his words sinking in. Then, slowly, applause began, building until it thundered through the hall. Not the wild frenzy of adoration, but a sound of respect. In that moment, the performance shifted. For the rest of the night, every song carried a deeper resonance, as though the audience now heard not just the entertainer, but the man. They cheered not only the music, but the heart behind it. The newspapers the next morning didn't just review the show. Headlines carried the story of Elvis and the stray. Photographs of him leaving the clinic, cradling the kitten in his arms, spread across pages from Memphis to New York. Some called it a gesture, others a revelation. To the fans, it was proof that the man they loved wasn't only a voice or a spectacle, but a soul who cared, even for what the world dismissed as insignificant. Back in Memphis, days later, the kitten began to recover. The medicine worked, the feeding steadied its fragile frame, and its eyes grew brighter, clearer. Elvis kept calling to check in, asking about its appetite, its weight, the sound of its purr. Eventually, knowing his own schedule would pull him away, he entrusted the animal to a close family friend, someone with a quiet home and gentle children who promised to keep it safe. He visited when he could, crouching down to let the now stronger creature paw at his hand. Each time, he smiled that private smile, the one few ever saw. He didn't speak often about it afterward, at least not to the press. But among his circle, the story became something like a parable. The night the king paused everything for a life no bigger than his hand. On stage, in the months that followed, a subtle change took root. Between songs, he spoke less about fame, less about the machine that surrounded him, and more about gratitude, about holding on to compassion no matter how high you climbed. Audiences noticed. They felt it. The man who had once been accused of shaking culture loose with rebellion now reminded them of something gentler, yet no less powerful. Years later, those who had been in the crowd that night in Vegas still remembered the hush that fell before his words, the way his voice carried not just melody, but truth. And those who had been in that waiting room at the Memphis clinic told their families the story, passing it on as proof that greatness wasn't measured only in records sold or theaters filled, but in the willingness to stop for the smallest life. The legacy of that night wasn't written in contracts or reviews. It was written in memory, in quiet retellings, in the image of a man whose heart could not overlook a cry in the dark. And somewhere in Memphis, in the modest home of a friend, the kitten he had once carried against his chest stretched on a sunny windowsill, alive because Elvis Presley had listened, not to applause, not to schedules, but to the faint, desperate sound of need. On stage in Vegas, thousands of miles away, Elvis leaned into the spotlight, voice soaring, while far from the neon and the roar, a small heartbeat he had saved kept time with the music.